A few weeks ago, we plotted out my next musical. Today, we're going to take that skeleton and begin to give it some of its vital organs by talking about the tone and perspectives of the show. Hi, I'm Cash, a composer writing a brand new musical and documenting the process in a series of videos right here on YouTube. If you're a fan of theater and want to see how a production comes to fruition, subscribe so you don't miss a thing. I post every other week. Those of you who don't already know, this show is about Lavinia Fisher. Some believe her to be the first female serial killer in America, but all historical evidence points to her innocence above anything else. Thus, when it comes to this show, there's two distinct sets of perspectives, the guilty versus the innocent. The first party is comprised of those who looked down on the Fishers, while the second is comprised of those who wished for their freedom. We'll dissect each of these perspectives in brief, dividing them into three groups: the Fishers themselves, the individuals with whom they interacted, and of course the public audience. What we're going to do here is look at the story, specifically the historical story, from the perspective of each individual or group. We'll summarize it first, then we'll take a look at the mood of the piece. And lastly, we'll talk about the ghost story side of things. To learn more about what I'm talking about there, check out the video I did a few weeks ago where we actually discussed having two simultaneous plots, one being the legend and the other one being fact. Lavinia is the star of our show and the subject of great contention, so let's look at her facts first. She is born into slavery alongside her sister. She falls in love and is separated from said love when she's sold to a man in another city far, far away. Her love follows her and does whatever he has to do to free her and her sister. They start their life together, but her sister sadly passes away. In the wake of this tragedy, they begin a business together, giving wayfarers a home for a moment. But this is barely off the ground when they are stolen away from their home and it is burned to the ground. She spends a year in jail and every hope for a reprieve is dashed before she is finally executed next to her love. From Lavinia's perspective, this is no doubt a tragedy, a bittersweet love story that leans harder on the bitter than the sweet. She is never free, even in death. So it's not just a forbidden romance between her and some guy, it's a star-crossed situation with her own freedom. She has multiple moments where she believes she'll finally be free, falling in love, being freed from the slave owner in Charleston, when John escapes the jail, when someone else confesses, and even in the act of death. But it never works out. She is, for all intents and purposes, still captive. Freedom just out of reach. The romance just adds an element to it that gives her some light in her life between all of these false promises. John is our deuteragonist, a boy, for all intents and purposes, who knows nothing of the world. He makes mistakes and ends up back at home where he falls in love with the one person that he shouldn't. When she is separated from him, he leaves his family behind to pursue her and does whatever he has to do to free her. He works and lies, he cheats and steals, he scrimps and saves, and finally, they are together. They begin to build a life together, only to have it snatched away by a mob that both figuratively and literally burns everything to the ground. But he is still determined to save her. He escapes, but she can't follow, so he desperately begins that same hunt for a bribe to buy her freedom once more. But now the price is just too high. He chooses, rather than to escape and live a long life as a free man without her, to stay and die by her side, leaving behind all that he has in a cryptic message. From John's perspective, this is a romance where he will do anything for the girl. She is Rapunzel and he is her prince, but the tower keeps climbing ever higher. It's almost a fairy tale, really, except that we don't get a happy ending. Except to John, he kinda did. We know from first-hand accounts that while Lavinia was broken and sobbing at the gallows, John was stoic and embraced her, holding it together for her sake. We know that he got caught when he easily could have escaped. He was caught underneath a boat when he could have used that boat to sail far, far away. And we can surmise that that was because he chose to stay to be with her. He spent the rest of his life with the love of his life, however brief that rest was. So looking at these two perspectives, an immediate difference jumps out. One is a quest for freedom never realized, and the other is a romance fated to end too soon. But they share a common thread: love. Now, in the actual show, I'm not going to name the various side characters just for the sake of simplicity. Rather, I will just refer to them by their titles or their relationships to the Fishers. But I will give you the sister's name for the sake of this video, and that is Sally. Sally was Lavinia's sister, and she was torn from the only home she had ever known down to Charleston, and eventually freed, only to die a short while later. Her life was even more brief and tragically cut short than Lavinia's, but she always had her sister beside her. I don't know if you've ever read Little Women, but here's a spoiler. Tragically, the character of Beth dies. It's one of the most heart-wrenching moments in all of literature, and it still makes me so upset to even begin to think about it. However, Beth would not consider her own life a tragedy. Far from it. She lived a simple life, and she only ever wanted to care for others, and she did just that until she passed. Even after her passing, she inspired her sisters to be better, that loving spirit living just as strong even when she wasn't there. She would consider her life a quiet one, but a good one. Sally is a lot like Beth in this regard. She may not have had a long life, nor a life free from tragedy, just as the Marches faced poverty, she faced enslavement, but she always had the love of her sister. In this way, I would consider her perspective that of whatever the familial equivalent of a romance is, one with a bittersweet ending. Lavinia could not bury her properly in a churchyard, but she was able to bury her at home. The preacher in question is Reverend Furman, a man who attended to the Fishers during their incarceration. He attended to them while they were imprisoned and saw their execution at the gallows, even reading out John's final words and delivering the notice of their passing, along with his thoughts on the two, to the papers. He expressed a belief that John was repentant and sorrowful, seeking forgiveness, while Lavinia was of wrong passions and feelings. It is well known that Furman was, well, to put it briefly, racist. He literally wrote the book on it and was a staunch defender of slavery. Obviously, he would not take kindly to a freed slave on death row, and no matter what she said, he would take it as a slight. To him, this is a story of justice, of a man finding forgiveness in the Lord through prayer, while a sinner faces the depths of hell for her ignorance of truth. The executioner's tale was actually given to us by the attorney John Blake White. We'll get to his perspective in a second. I'll summarize the executioner here. He stayed in the next room over from those huddled together in the prison cells, getting drunk, banging on the walls, sharpening his axe to cut the rope. He too was a kind of prisoner. Physically, in that he was kept in his own cell until his duty was done, and psychologically, in that he had to stay in a drunken stupor in order to live with himself, with his profession as a governmentally ordained murderer. He showed up to the gallows and let the Fishers hang, then lived with that guilt for the remainder of his sorry life. To the executioner, this isn't a story at all. It's a blip not worthy of remembrance. If he remembers this one, he has to remember them all. It cannot be a tragedy, it cannot be justice, it cannot be anything but forgotten. Otherwise, he has to face his actions, what he has done, and it does not matter that it was dictated by law or that he was paid to do it. One's moral compass is not altered for the sake of the law or money, as there is no authority so great nor a price so high that could change one's own ethics. Attorney John Blake White is one of 3 people who were so profoundly affected by the Fishers that they tried to get rid of the death penalty completely. He was there for the Fishers. He is the one who heard their story, who witnessed the conditions of the prison, who watched them be hanged. He wrote down what he saw and implored for the lawmakers of South Carolina to end the death penalty once and for all, for something so heinous as this should never happen. To him, this was a call to action. He was witness to something horrible and saw it as an example of everything wrong with the law, so he sought to change it. This was the start of a story of a search for justice, a need for change. Nathaniel Cleary, a sheriff of Charleston at the time, was not guiltless in this story. Rather, he is the only individual who saw a change in his beliefs, but too late. He was the one who organized the mob to arrest the Fishers, and he was the one who sent them to jail. However, he began to see that this was unjust, but could not do anything to free them, as he was ousted from his post as sheriff. After their death, he was driven to write to the members of the Senate and the House of Representatives, insisting that they demolish the death penalty, pronouncing it unjustly cruel. To him, this is a tale of redemption. He found himself on the wrong side of morality, even when he was following the letter of the law, and changed his beliefs and worked to try to make the world a better place. He was not faultless, but he was the only person in this entire tale to have such a dramatic change in his person. Incredibly, he's the Prince Zuko of this story. The witness here is another pastor, Samuel Gilman. Hailing from Boston, he took up residence in Charleston just before the Fishers' execution, and it would have been the very first execution he witnessed here. He wrote back up to the folks in Boston, and his letter was anonymously published in a bid to, once again, abolish the death penalty. He had much the same perspective as the lawyer, but he was up close to the Fishers, given his position as a preacher, so he saw the emotion between them all too closely. Gilman was from the North, so his beliefs regarding the enslaved population differed greatly from your average Southerner. In public, he was tight-lipped, but in private, he did what he could to prepare slaves for freedom, or even to try to free them. He did keep slaves, but he was conflicted in doing so, as it was family tradition that he found difficult to distance himself from. He would not be considered any kind of ally by today's standards, but back then he was immensely progressive. To him, this would be the beginning of his story, establishing the tone for his life here in Charleston, seeing the beliefs of the South come to a head in such a visceral display. Perhaps even a horror story. The Governor Geddes saw the execution of the Fishers as an opportunity to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, to get their land such that he could sell it to the Navy for a massive profit, and to make an example of an interracial relationship such that no one else would dare fall in love with a slave ever again. To him, this was a story of success. He wouldn't see himself as the villain, he would see himself as a crafty businessman and an effective politician. If anything, this would be a fable demonstrating political savviness at its finest, and how things always work out for those morally on the high ground. Dr. Joseph Glover was the original purchaser of Lavinia, bringing her down to Charleston in the first place. He then saw a profit on her when her freedom was purchased by John. Several years later, her body was buried in a potter's field owned by the very institution he was associated with as the Surgeon General for South Carolina's Medical Society. It would have been under his purview to see her dug up and put on display in the Charleston Museum, as he believed himself to be the owner of her and her body, even in death. He would likely see this story as a tale of the divine right of slavery. Again, as a kind of fable, proving that things always work out in the end. Now, the stranger is the only side character that doesn't actually have a name, Because he's partially invented from me cobbling together multiple things into one cohesive narrative of a character. His story begins when he comes to Charleston to stay at the 6 Mile Wayfarer house and sets up shop. He commits robberies up and down the highway and figures that the finger will be pointed at the Fishers. However, when it escalates to them losing their home, he is conflicted. Eventually, just before their execution date, he goes to the law and confesses his guilt. However, they deny him and execute the Fishers anyways, and John makes the stranger promise to carry out his last will and testament, which the stranger does. To him, this is a story of guilt akin to crime and punishment. The deeds he did ended up punishing the wrong people, and he tried to right the wrong, but couldn't, so he did what he could to carry out their wishes at the end. It's a story of resolve. I don't know why, but his perspective reminds me of those post-apocalyptic stories where the protagonist begins alone and ends alone, but changed. To the slaves at the Fisher place, this would be a story of loss. To the slaves at the Glover place, this would be a story of envy. Either way, it's a story of longing for what you cannot have. To the tenants of the 6 Mile house, this would be a story of fear, living afraid that you would be the next victim of some unknown assailant, and then seeing your fears realized when the temporary home you had known for so little time goes up in flames, thinking that maybe your hosts were instead your captors, the puppeteers pulling the strings. To the mob that accosted the Fishers at their home, this would be a story of justice. No mob considers themselves the bad guys, although very nearly every group described as a mob in fiction ends up being the bad guy. They went and got the bad guys and put them where they belonged. Victory! To the prisoners alongside the Fishers at the jail, this would be a story of loss and envy, and just another day, really. Just like the slaves, it would only end in death. To the crowd watching the execution, this is a story of voyeurism, of a show being put on for their morbid curiosity, what some may call a sick pleasure. It is justice, but it is also crass and wild, feeding that need for schadenfreude that people so often crave. Now to the tour guide, it's a ghost story about a murderer who faced justice but refused to go down quietly. It's a horror story, it's a scary story, but not so scary that they actually believe the ghosts to be real. Lastly, we have our audience, the folks taking the tour. To them, this is history. It is fact, presented for their pleasure, to give context to the world around them, to add color to the years past. It becomes all of the stories above, but primarily it is a story about death, as everything is colored by the knowledge that it ended with death. There are so many perspectives here, it's hard to decide what the overarching tone should be. Look at Sweeney Todd. To Anthony, it's a tale of star-crossed lovers. To Sweeney, it's a tale of vengeance. To the judge, it's a tale of the past coming back to bite him. And to Lovett, it's a bit of a romance. And to Joanna, it's a tale of never being free. I would describe the actual musical as a little bit of all of those things, with some humor and a focus on the humanity above the horror. As another example, look at Les Miserables. To Jean Valjean, it's a tale of redemption. To Javert, it's a search for justice and a search for identity. To Fantine, it's a tragedy. To Cosette, it's a romance in 2 parts, finding a family and finding a man. To Enjolras, it's a revolution. To Eponine, it's a sacrifice. There's so much that happens, and so many perspectives. Every single song demonstrates the perspective of a character or characters singing it very clearly, often conflicting viewpoints at the same time, and yet It harmonizes so beautifully in a cohesive manner, such that it never feels like it's jolting back and forth between ideas. Now, all this talk of perspectives reminds me of the parable of three blind men and the elephant. I think it's a Buddhist or Hindu tale originally, but essentially, these three blind men come up to an elephant and reach out to touch it, as that is how they understand the world. The first one reaches its trunk and says, "Ah, it's just a big old snake." The second one touches its ear and goes, no, it feels like a fan. And the last one goes, "No, you're all wrong." He touches the body of the elephant and says, "It's just a big wall." All of them are correct, but none of them are correct, because all of their perspectives are legitimate, but none of them are seeing the whole picture. And that is what I have to present to the audience, that whole picture. So how do these musicals manage having so many different stories happening all at once when they're really all the same story? Well, it's a matter of balance, demonstrating all of those perspectives while maintaining a strong through line. In Sweeney Todd, that through line is revenge. In Les Miserables, that through line is Jean Valjean and his arc. In this show, that through line is going to be love. It always was, wasn't it? Lavinia and John were executed on February 18th, 4 days after Valentine's Day. I mean, it's incredible, isn't it, the timing? I've described this as an almost Romeo and Juliet, and it truly is just that. Just as Shakespeare told us all about the romance, there's so much more going on. But that love remains clear and solid throughout the story, never failing, never faltering. I plan to take a look at Romeo and Juliet as a follow-up to this video at some point to go into further detail on how that is accomplished in that particular play, so that I can take notes on what to do with this show. Look at Joanna and One Day More as examples of songs which perfectly demonstrate several perspectives at once, hence why I use Sweeney and Les Mis respectively as my examples. Both songs feature repetitions of old melodies alongside a new uniting melody. That united song demonstrates the through line of the piece, while the old melodies give glimpses into the many other facets. As I begin writing the book for the show, you'll begin to see how this plays out. Each song that I write, each word of dialogue, each note, everything is informed by that perspective. Whose am I prioritizing at the moment? Which is coming through clearly and which one isn't quite there yet? Are the voices strong or barely there? Who are you, Lavinia Fisher? Alright, I think that's all for today. If you want to learn more about the perspectives I've mentioned here, check out my research playlist on screen right now somewhere to hear all of every side of the story. Next video, I'll be talking about the literal voices of the characters, going through the variety of archetypes and deciding what best fits these characters. Until next time, bye y'all!